Okay, so moving on in the chemistry part of this class, we're going to move on from chapter 2, which was all about water and properties of water, into chapter 3, which is going to get into some of the other important molecules found in living things. So I'm going to title this at the top, chapter 3. Chapter 3. And chapter 3 in our book is called Carbon and the Molecular Diversity of Life. Okay, so what we are going to discuss is in the AP curriculum, it's topic 1.2, and it's all about the elements of life. What elements are important, and therefore what molecules do those elements comprise? All right, so let's do a Roman numeral number 1. And I'm going to abbreviate CHOMPS. Whoops, that's supposed to be an HONPS. These are the 6 elements that are found in the majority of molecules that comprise living things. All right, so let's write here the elements in most molecules that comprise living things. Okay, so let's make an A underneath there. And so atoms and molecules from the environment are necessary to build new molecules. So we all started out as much smaller organisms than we are right now as a baby, and then you grew and you are made of more atoms and molecules than you were when you were a baby. Well, where do those atoms and molecules come from? Well, they come from the environment, but how do we get them into our body? So they come from the environment, and I'm going to put here from the environment. I'm going to say that we really eat and breathe those molecules, or those atoms, and then we rearrange the atoms to form molecules that are important to our bodies. All right, and so that's where those come from. And so let's look at some of these. I'm just going to pick a few important elements here. So let's talk about carbon. All right, carbon, I'll write it out. All right, we should know that C is carbon, but I'll write it out. So carbon is, let's talk about a couple of things with carbon. It's used to build some important molecules and living things, and we're going to build on this later. I'm just going to introduce it to you. They're used to build carbohydrates. Sugars, starch are examples of that. Proteins, lipids, those are your kinds of fats, and nucleic acids. Nucleic acids, you probably have heard of them as DNA and RNA. So those are your types of nucleic acids. Also with carbon, so they're used to build these molecules for us, and then it's also used in storage compounds. So when we store energy for later use in our body, and the formation of cells. Cells are made up of molecules that contain carbon. So carbon, we are considered a carbon-based life form because most of our molecules, carbon is kind of the backbone of it. All right, so let's look at another important element besides carbon. Another one is nitrogen. Nitrogen is just N, abbreviated on the periodic table. So nitrogen, I'm not going to put an A and a B underneath there because we don't have an A and a B. We're just going to write, this is important, it's used to build, just like carbon, but it's not as versatile as carbon. It's not all of these. So the carbon had these four things, which are the four major types of molecules in the body. So nitrogen is used to build protein and nucleic acids. So when we look at the structure of these next week, you'll see that these are the only two out of these four that actually have nitrogen in their structure. And then the third one that we're going to talk about is phosphorus. That's just P. And phosphorus is used to build nucleic acids is the big one. And also certain lipids. Okay. So these are our atoms and molecules. Now atoms and molecules come together to form molecules. So I want to talk about a major, I changed it, B here, I put a period here in a parenthesis here. Should be a period here, but that's okay. The first kind of molecule that I want to talk about is a type of molecule that is made out of carbon. I said most of our molecules, carbon is the backbone, but just carbon and hydrogen, all right? So carbon and hydrogen, if a molecule is just made out of those two elements, they are considered hydrocarbons. Hydro referring to hydrogen, and then carbon referring to carbon. All right, so these are molecules containing just, and I'm going to abbreviate C and H for carbon and hydrogen. So let me give you some examples of some hydrocarbons. I'm not going to give you necessarily the names, but I'm going to put here underneath the number 1 here. I want to give you some examples of some drawings of hydrocarbons. So a hydrocarbon we could draw like this. All right, let's do real simple, 2 carbons. And carbon makes 4 bonds, so they're making 1 bond to each other, so I'm going to add 3 more hydrogens. Now, oftentimes we don't write it like this. We could write it like when you're comparing the hydrocarbons, we can look at just the carbon backbone. So this part right here is called the carbon backbone. All right, so oftentimes to make it less messy, if we're talking about a hydrocarbon, they might just show the carbon skeleton, and then you just know that every carbon makes 4 bonds, and so you can imagine that there's hydrogens here, but it just makes it a little bit messy. All right, so this is an example of a hydrocarbon. Another example would be 3 carbons in a row. So our examples of hydrocarbons, these 2 right here, we can see that hydrocarbons, I should put here, may differ in length. Okay, so you could have ones that are 10 carbons long. All right. So that is, maybe we should say that that's example A. Then example B here, let's look at the way that they can differ. So in this case here, I'm going to do 4 carbons in a row. And if I do that, you imagine that there are hydrogens coming off of here. What is the molecular formula for this? So carbon would be first, so I would say that this is C4, that there's 4 carbons. And then how many hydrogens would be attached to that? I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So our formula would be C4H10. And we would say that this is a linear molecule because each carbon is attached to another one in a line. Notice this. Watch how I draw this next one. I'm going to put 3 in a row, and then I'm going to put the next carbon coming off the top. Now, this is not linear, all right? So you have, if I were to draw a line through there, you have 3 in a row, but you can't go up here. This 4th one is not connected there in a line. So this is your major carbons line there, and then you have a branch. So this is called branched. All right, and so, but notice here, see if you can write the formula. What would it be? C what, H what? So pause this and see if you can do that. So hopefully you came back and you said that there are 4 carbons. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10. If we look here, these guys, notice, have the same formula, but they have a different shape, all right? And so these 2 right here are what we call isomers. So I'm going to put here, they may be isomers. You may have talked about that in chemistry, and I'm going to put in parentheses what that means. They're different molecules. If they have a different shape, most often they have a different function. Shape, that's a big theme in biology. Shape determines function. And so they're going to not be the same molecule. So different molecules because they have the same formula, but a different shape, and that makes them a different molecule, and that makes them have a different purpose in the body or in the cell or wherever it may be. I want to give you an example here of this, of an isomer. Back in the 50s and the 60s, there was a medication called Thalidomide, and it was given to pregnant women, all right, in the 50s and 60s. But what they figured out, they gave it to these pregnant women, and it was supposed to decrease morning sickness. And when they gave it to them, they found that the mixture actually were 2 isomers of one another. So the drug, one isomer decreased the morning sickness, but the other isomer actually caused birth defects in the babies. And so therefore they were giving it to pregnant women to decrease their morning sickness, which was the desired effect, but they found that there was mixed into that the isomer that had a detrimental effect. And so so that was an unfortunate thing that happened in the 50s and 60s, but just to show you that 2 molecules can have the same formula, be isomers of each other, but that different shape can be deadly or be a really big deal. Okie doke. Another thing that I want to talk about with the examples is letter C here. Letter C, that the carbon skeleton doesn't have to be linear or branched. It may be rings like this. All right, and so it may be rings like that, and then you'd put hydrogens off of those. All right, and so sometimes you'll see the ring shape of a carbon like this, where they just do, where at each point, get a different color here, at each point would be a carbon atom. So instead of, sometimes I try and simplify it even more by not even putting the carbons, but knowing that each point would be a carbon atom. So I want to point that out because sometimes you'll see drawings where that's the case, and so I want you to know that for that. So these are ring-shaped. And so when we do sugars, we'll see that a lot of sugars are ring-shaped. Okay, so the second thing I want to write, so we're going to do number 2 here about hydrocarbons, is that hydrocarbons are nonpolar or hydrophobic. So meaning that the bond between the carbon and hydrogen, the electrons are shared equally, so neither one of them have a partial charge. So therefore there's no charge on a hydrocarbon. So that means that if you put a hydrocarbon into water, which has a negative and positive end, are not going to be attracted to it, and therefore hydrocarbons don't mix well with water, hence the hydrophobic. So they also don't dissolve in water. So an example would be, I'll put here, think of oil. Oil is a hydrocarbon. So if you tried to put vegetable oil in some water, it would separate out, and that's because there's no charges on it. All right, and the last thing that we're going to write about hydrocarbons are that they're energy rich, meaning that the bonds in that molecule have lots of energy, and so hydrocarbons, when you break those bonds, and you can get lots of energy from that. Okay? All right, so those are your hydrocarbons. So now what I want to do is look at, not most of our molecules in our cells are not hydrocarbons. They have other atoms attached. They might have carbon and hydrogen, but they have other atoms attached. So I'm close to the end of my page here, so I'm going to go to a new page. So I'm on letter C here. Okay. So letter C at the top here is going to be organic molecules. All right. So I'm going to write here that most organic molecules and I'm going to put in parentheses a definition. That means that they contain carbon. Are not hydrocarbons. So they have, that means that they have other atoms attached to it. Okay, I'm going to write then that they have groups of atoms called functional groups. And I'm going to underline that. It's a vocabulary word. Functional groups attached. And each functional group gives the molecule unique properties. Gives the molecule unique properties. And so I want to talk about those functional groups. In your textbook, also figure 3.6 shows the functional groups as well. Okie doke. So let's look. We're just going to go through the different functional groups. I'm going to kind of write them out. Like I'm going to write the group name and draw it out here. And then I'm going to write the name of the molecule that has that functional group. And then I'm going to write some properties. I said that each functional group gives the molecule it's attached to certain properties. So the first one That's right here. I'm just going to use as much room as I can here. Hydroxyl. Let's look at that name. The hydroxyl group, hydro, that's hydrogen, oxy is oxygen. So what that looks like is I'm going to draw a line, which represents a bond, an O and an H. What that means is that this group, whoops, my light's turned off, this group would be attached to the rest of the molecule. So there would be the rest of the molecule over here. So it would be coming off of that. So I could have like an example, 2 carbons like this and an OH off of it, and then there would be H's coming off of the rest of those. So that's what I mean. Sometimes it's shorthanded. Instead of drawing the bond between the OH, they just write it like this, knowing that you should know that there is a bond between the oxygen and hydrogen. So to show that here, it would look like this. All right, but there's a bond between those. So sometimes you'll see that shorthanded. I just want you to know that. Okay, so any molecule that has this hydroxyl group is called an alcohol. So I'm sure you've heard of alcohol before. Most of the names, this is the generic name, alcohol. Most of the alcohol names will end in OL, like methanol, ethanol, and they have hydroxyl groups. And so what a hydrocarbon by itself, something that's made out of just carbons and hydrogens, does not have a charge and is nonpolar. We're going to see that all of these most of these functional groups add polarity to the molecule. So this is polar, so I'm going to put here for the properties, it's polar. And because of that, because it adds polarity to the molecule, it helps it dissolve, the molecule that it's attached to. All right, so that's the hydroxyl group. So I'm going to kind of alternate groups, and so we don't get them mixed up. I'm going to pick a different color here. All right, so I'm going to pick this color right here and do the next group, and I'll just alternate so that we can see which one belongs to which one. Okie doke. Carbonyl group is the next. Carbonyl. All right, this looks like, here's the bond to the rest of the molecule. It's a C with a double bond to an O. All right, C with a double bond to an O. That's the carbonyl. And then the names here, there are 2 names. It could be a ketone. And the ketone is if, let me draw here, the C with the double bonded oxygen. So this is coming off of a carbon in the middle of the molecule. So see how it's not on the end? This is the middle. All right, so I'm going to put here, it's in the middle of the molecule. Or the carbonyl could be what's called an aldehyde, and that is on the end. So let me do the 3 here. This is the end carbon, all right? All right, so it's at the end here. So, but they're both, so drawing this is the carbonyl group, and this is the carbonyl group. So aldehyde, end, they both kind of start with a similar sound there, so that's how I always remembered that. Okay, so then properties of this is the same as up here. So it adds polarity to the molecule and helps it dissolve. Whoops, don't need an S on the end of that. Okay, so that's the carbonyl. All right, I'm going to go back to my black. And the next one is called carboxyl. Whoops, carboxyl. All right, so what does that look like? This looks like this. There's the bond to the rest of the molecule, and there's a C with a double bond to an O as well as to an OH. Notice that this, if you have a double bond to an O and an OH, this collectively is called the carboxyl group. This looks very similar to the carbonyl group, but if you have and this right here looks similarly to the hydroxyl group, but if they're coming off of the same carbon atom, it's not the carbonyl or the carboxyl group, it is collectively the carboxyl group. And this, molecules that have this are called carboxylic acids. And that means they act as an acid. So what is their properties? They're polar. They helps dissolve. But then the third thing for this, whoops, I'm kind of off here, sorry about that. The third thing I wanted to write is that it's an acid. What does an acid mean? It gives off H plus ions, those hydrogen ions, in solution. That means in a water-based solution. So let me show you that. So here's my carboxyl group, my O with the H. What actually happens, I'm going to get a different color here, I'll get orange here. When you put this molecule, whatever this molecule is, here's the rest of the molecule, but it has this carboxyl group. Whenever you put it into a solution, this is going to come off as an H plus ion, all right? And so when that happens, it's gonna notice it has a positive charge now. It leaves its one electron with this oxygen. Hydrogen has one proton and one electron. It leaves it with that, and so oxygen would have a slightly negative charge left over, and the H plus is given off. And so that's what an acid does. Now my next question is, what would happen to the pH of the solution? Would it go up or down? Do you remember what acids do? If you said that it would go down, you would be correct, all right? So it would decrease the pH. All right, so that is the carboxyl group. Let's switch colors again, and let's do the amino group. So I'm going to come over here, amino. All right, this looks like this. It has an N, nitrogen, so this is the bond to the rest of the molecule, and two H's. That's the amino group. Anything that has this, the molecule would be called an amine. And the properties. So again, it would be polar, helps it dissolve. So that's the same, hitting home that those two things are the same through most of these functional groups. But something unique about the amino group, this one acted as an acid, this one acts as a base. What does a base mean? It means that it accepts H pluses. So acids give them off, increasing the hydrogen ion concentration in the solution. Bases accept it, all right, and therefore decrease the H pluses in the solution and changing the pH. So let me show you how this happens. So example one here, here's your amino group. Here's your amino group. And what happens is if this molecule with this amino group is put into a solution that has H pluses, what happens is, I should put that in a different color here just to illustrate. Let me go over it here with green. So this is in the solution. What happens is this is a polar covalent bond, and so the nitrogen, just like oxygen and hydrogen and water don't share electrons equally, and oxygen has a slightly negative charge. That's the same here with the nitrogen. The nitrogen has a slightly negative charge, and so what happens is this H plus is attracted to that, and it attaches and bonds, the opposite charges attract to that nitrogen. And so therefore the H plus would no longer be in solution, and therefore takes the H pluses out of the solution. And that's by definition what a base is. That is one way that it can act, things can act as a base. Okay, so so that's what happens there. All right, so that is your amino group. Let's go back to the black color. All right, and under amino, we're going to write sulfhydryl. Sulfhydryl. All right, this looks like an SH. So that's the sulfur, and hydra is the hydrogen. Again, remember, it's really like this. All right, but they just always shorthand that. If something has this, it's called a thiol. And the properties here are polar, helps it dissolve, again, common theme, helps it dissolve. And then one other thing that is unique for this is it stabilizes protein structure. We're going to see when we look at proteins that some proteins are super, super strong, like the proteins that are found in the hooves of animals. I mean, think about how hard those hooves are. And so those proteins have a lot of sulfhydryl groups, and I'll show you later on that they can bond to each other, and it's a really strong bond. All right, so that's your sulfhydryl group. We have two more groups. It looks like I'm going to have to go over to another sheet of paper here, I think, but I can fit one more on here. All right, we have the phosphate group. The phosphate group looks like this. All right, it has a P, an O, and this is where it would bond to the rest of the molecule, and then a double bond to an O, and then an O with a negative charge, and an O with a negative charge. All right, so that's what that looks like, and that's why they call it the phosphate group, because it has phosphorus, and the molecules that have this are called organic phosphates. Usually the part of the molecule that I didn't draw over here would have carbon in it, hence the organic. All right, so what's true about these guys? These are polar, helps the molecule it's attached to dissolve in water. But something unique about this is that it can transfer energy between molecules. So let me just, since I have a little room over here, let me just give you an example. You guys remember ATP from biology? It's an adenosine molecule. I'm just going to put an A for adenosine, but the TP stands for triphosphate. There's 3 phosphate groups. So there's a phosphate, and then there are 2 more, and I'm going to put a little squiggly line here. This is an unstable bond that when those bonds are broken, energy can be released. And so, so that's these are phosphate groups. These are what we have here as part of ATP. Okay, so then let's look at the last one, which is the methyl group. And I write too big, so I have to go ahead and put it on a last little sheet of paper here. And so the name is the methyl group. Okay, this looks like this. C with 3 H's, or sometimes it's written as CH3. All right, so this, if you see this, it really means that it would be attached this way. And these molecules are just called methylated. That means it has a methyl group attached to it. Methylated compounds. And this is the only group that is nonpolar, the only functional group. And so these would be, so really a hydrocarbon would have lots of little methyl groups on the ends there. So nonpolar, which means it does not help dissolve it. It is hydrophobic. And that's the only one there that is. All right, so this is where I'm going to stop our video for today.